Forbes Books presents Leading What Matters Most, the podcast that helps you change behaviors, improve performance, and unlock the potential of your people. Here's Phil Geldart.
Today, my guest is Bob Tweedie. Bob is a true talent development trailblazer. He's got over 20 years of experience building high-impact global leadership and learning programs. Bob has served as head of learning for Deloitte Global and leading learning and development initiatives across 12 Blackstone portfolio companies. So, Bob, we're really thrilled to have you. We're thrilled to have your experience to share with us today. Thank you so much for being here.
Phil, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the invite. I'm excited about this conversation and can't wait to see where we land.
Yeah, one of the things that I really think you can share some insight on is what you really feel it takes for a leader to do or display or demonstrate if they're going to get at the full potential of the workforce. You've had a lot of experience yourself as a great leader and also helping other leaders. So what would you share with our listeners today about what a leader needs to do to really get at the potential of the workforce?
To me, Phil, it's the workforce is such a large and broad term. Culture is everything. So what's going to work for one company is not going to work for another. And that's why you see some leaders come in and they're extremely successful in one company, but they're not as successful in the other. And so I think before we get anywhere in this conversation, we need to really define what we mean by workforce. Today, if you look at the workforce, there's at least 4, if not 5 generations in the workforce. The largest representation in our workforce, of course, is millennials. So if you are describing workforce, are you leading millennials? Are you leading Gen Z? Are you leading Gen X? And so one size certainly does not fit all.
Yeah, now you raised 2 very interesting points. So let's just go back to the one that you just covered off before we get to the second, which was the idea of the different levels. Talk to me a little bit about culture, because you say that one type of leadership skills may be really effective in one culture and not in another. So culture is perhaps broader than the various types of folks that you're leading. So let's explore that for a minute, and then we'll get to the various types that you may be leading.
Culture is fascinating because it's one of those things that, and I know you've written on this, Phil, it's one of those things that you know it when you see it. And companies go a long way to defining culture. But then who is the culture in the hands of? And typically it's seen to be an HR-driven exercise. But in order for culture to truly take place, to truly add value to an organization, it has to be defined collectively by the leaders at all different levels throughout the organization. So senior leadership, mid-level leadership, but also fully embraced by more junior individuals on the team. If you think about culture in the broader sense, it has to be a living, breathing organism that's present in everything that you do. You have to hire for it. You have to fire for it. And we can have some interesting conversations there, Phil. You have to communicate constantly around what culture is and what it means. And then you have to reward it. Then the final piece I would say is that you will truly have to live it on the day-to-day. I'd be interesting to ask senior leaders if they could define the views of the company that they're supposed to lead. I would imagine that most would have to go back to the website and actually read what those values are. So
let me just pause there, because I do think that the values of a company define its culture. But very often the values are not the ones which are posted on the wall or on the website. They're the actual ones that you see every day in the workplace, which comes back to how do the leaders lead? And when the values on the website are different than what you're seeing in your leaders, then I think you have a really confused culture and people don't really know what it is that they're supposed to be doing. So how do the leaders deal with that? What would you recommend? How do you approach that problem?
Culture means different things to so many different people. You have the organizational culture, but then you also have the culture that you gravitate towards as a leader and want to see, almost a subculture, if you like, in the function or the department that you lead. One of the tools that I find super helpful for a leader in order to truly understand culture and the culture that they gravitate towards is Hogan. The motives, values, and preference indicators are a fantastic tool for leaders. If you haven't taken the Hogan, I would strongly recommend taking that suite of assessments. And when I work with senior leaders around the Hogan, they're often very surprised at the disconnect between the type of culture that they gravitate towards and the type of culture that's ever present in the organization. It goes back to what I was saying before about how some leaders can be very successful in one culture, but not in another. So that's really the first place that I would start, is to understand as an individual, as a leader, what culture do you gravitate towards, and what culture will you then generate in the function or the company that you lead. That would be the starting point for me.
Okay. Which then presumably leads into recruiting and promotion and succession planning, that you're trying to find the leaders that have a good fit with the culture you aspire to.
You know, Phil, I recently wrote a very interesting case study around how one particular CEO built a very successful culture at one of the portfolio companies that I supported at Blackstone. It was interesting because they had an entire talent management process designed around it. A new CEO came in to an existing company. His mandate was very, very clear. Take the resources from a new private equity company and then grow the business exponentially, which required to hire a lot of individuals, including senior leadership. And as he set about to build out that culture, he built it organically. He built it with his senior leadership team, so it wasn't just his culture. And then he had a number of different steps around it. And then when I asked him as part of the case study, when I was writing it, I said, if you could go back and do one thing differently, what would it be? He said, there were some individuals on the team that did not support the culture. They did not walk the talk. And so he said he would have fired people quicker, sooner and earlier, but he didn't out of loyalty to some individuals, which I guess as a human being, I can understand.
And was he successful in the end?
Well, I think it's still very much work in progress. But if you look at the culture that's in place now, I fundamentally believe that it's one of the most successful, one of the foundational reasonings why that company has been successful in the last couple of years. They, like you mentioned, they hire for it. So in that hiring process, they're looking for individuals that can carry that culture, that can fit in well with that culture, all the time bringing in their own diversity and different thought process into that. But then the performance management process is defined around it as well. They even spoke about individuals not being promoted because they weren't strong enough culture carriers. Very strong individually, excellent subject matter experts, individual contributors, but not necessarily carrying that culture in a way that the leadership team was looking for.
Okay, fascinating. I would agree with that. I think if an organization needs to have clarity on the culture, it begins at the CEO, who defines what that culture should be, and then as much as possible codifies the behaviors that are expected in the leaders to bring that culture to life, and then expects those leaders to demonstrate the behaviors and cascade them. So if you've got an organization where there's a gap between aspiration and realization, you really have to go back to the CEO and start there, I think. Some clients have said to me, can we start at the bottom up to build culture? I don't think culture starts bottom up. I think it starts top down. Would you agree?
I think it's at all levels, Phil. If you're coming into an organization and there's an existing culture there, or at least there's an aspiration for that culture, but nobody really knows what the culture is and the behaviors that are underlying, then you're on the path to disaster.
Yep.
Almost in everything that I see when it comes to leadership development or successful organizations, it starts with clarity of expectations. And clarity of expectations means defining what success looks like. And that's the same whether you're defining success for an individual role, a leadership role, or a team or an organization. And I think that's where companies stop, or they fall short, where they have this aspiration for whatever culture that looks like, but then they don't necessarily define the behaviors that are expected in order for that culture to be successful. There's some great examples out there, Phil, and I'm sure you've got plenty yourself, but the one that springs to mind about a company that's extremely successful when it comes to culture and extremely deliberate in everything that they do, is Bridgewater, the largest hedge fund in the world. Are you familiar with their efforts around culture there, Phil?
No. So elaborate a little bit for us.
It's fascinating. And there's been a lot written on it. Of course, Ray Dalio is the founder and the former CEO. I've been around for 40 years, just recently moved out of his role in the last year. He wrote a book around this called Principles. So I thoroughly recommend that. Excellent piece of reading. And there's been a lot of academic case studies being written around Bridgewater. One of the main principles that they have is based around this notion of radical transparency. And radical transparency is exactly how you might think it is. It's if you think it, you say it. And there's interviews and articles with the CEO saying, if all your life you've been told that your inside voice, you should keep to your inside, not necessarily speak up. But at Bridgewater, it's actively encouraged. And it's encouraged to the point that if somebody wants to deliver feedback to you, why deliver feedback just to you in a closed environment? Whereas if you're in a meeting or a group setting, everybody can benefit from that feedback. I know that's a culture that some people would love and gravitate towards. There's been a lot of follow-up literature and models being developed based on that, notably Radical Candor by Kim Scott. But then there's others that would say, that culture just wouldn't fit for me. I wouldn't be successful in that type of culture, and here's why. That's a fascinating case study for anybody looking to see how culture can really drive the business success of an organization.
Yeah, and it's intriguing to think about an individual being able to say, but that culture is not one that I would be comfortable in. That's not one that I would thrive in. It's not a criticism of them. It's just a personal preference. They're not comfortable with that, and they need to find a culture that they would be comfortable with.
And isn't it better for everybody to be fully aware of the culture and what life would look like once you move into that organization? I wonder how much money companies spend on hiring, and then 6 months later realizing that individual is just not right for the company. I've heard numbers of costs up to 1/3 of somebody's annual salary. And so think about the repercussions of that to senior leadership. Having the skills in this day and age is not enough for you to be successful.
Yeah, the more I get into the concept of culture, the more you realize that it has a huge impact on how you perform, how you respond to your colleagues, how you respond to your customers, which comes back to the fact that it's not something which you should just leave to chance. It's something that needs some attention. I know at Eagles Flight, we have some very clear cultural values. They've been with us for 30 years, and we're constantly reinforcing them because they provide waypoints that people can follow to know how to make decisions, how to interact with one another, how to interact with the customer. So you don't need constantly giving them policies and procedures. You just need clarity on the culture and the way we expect folks to interact with one another and their clients. So I agree, but again, I think that it requires an intentionality. It's not something you can just leave to chance.
Phil, I couldn't agree more. And if you take the example of the Big Four, back in the day it was the Big Eight, Big Six. Now it's the Big Four: Deloitte, PwC, KPMG, and Ernst & Young. The Big Four: consulting, audit, tax, legal, big behemoths in the professional services world. All four provide the same services, but it's not what they do; it's how they do it that separates them from each other. And so, if you think about just us as natural human beings, we gravitate towards individuals and organizations that have similar values to us, and that's why the Big Four spend a lot of time being extremely intentional about, if you come to work for us, here's what you're going to get. If you want to work with us as a client, here's the type of service that you can expect from us. And other than that, it's very, very difficult to make your choice between, each of the Big Four, other than price, of course.
Okay, let's go back to your earlier comment about the way in which you lead really depends on the strata, if you will, of folks that you're leading. So elaborate a little bit more on that for us.
If you think about managers today, they're so successful in what they do that we promote them out of the role for which they've been successful and for which they're being promoted for. And then very little companies, or very few companies, actually invest in the time to develop them as managers. And if they do, they spend a couple of days or 3 days, 4 days in a workshop. And then that's it. You're now ready to go and now be a successful, hopefully, manager or leader of others. And what many programs today do not take into consideration is management or leadership is not a one-size-fits-all approach. If you're looking at the levels across the organization and the different generations that we have, I feel it's a massive opportunity for anybody getting into leadership development is to really understand what different demographics are in the workplace and how those demographics differ in order to be able to adapt your management style accordingly. So if you're talking about before, Phil, about your question about how do you release the potential of the workforce, what's going to work for Gen Z is not going to work necessarily for somebody that's a little bit further down along in their career, such as Generation X or even baby boomers.
I had a guest on an earlier podcast chatting about that and the research that's coming out around Gen Z and what they want from the workforce and what they expect from their jobs. And it is certainly very different from generation to generation. So if you're a leader and you're having to manage these different groups, what advice have you got? Is it simply a matter of going to training programs? Is it a matter of being a better listener? Is it a matter of the organization trying to help you understand the differences in the groups? What would you advise?
Well, what I'm about to say next, Phil, might sound like professional suicide, but training doesn't work. It just doesn't. And every time I say this, people go, doesn't it say that you're a trainer, head of L&D on your business card? And of course, the answer is training is fundamental to everything that we do, particularly when we're learning skills for the first time, but it's not enough. And so any workshop that we put in place, it has to be followed up with on-the-job coaching, one-on-one, performance management recognition, the full life cycle. And then we build on it and we get feedback from our leaders as we get more and more ingrained in our own leadership style. But when it comes to managing different generations, I think simply having the understanding that one style may work for one generation is not necessarily going to work for others. But of course, in leading teams, what I start with is getting to know all of my team members on a one-on-one individual basis. Understanding, we do a team charter exercise, so we understand their understanding of the role, compare that to my understanding of the role. Coming back to the earlier point about defining expectations for success, it has to start there. But then also thinking about short-term, longer-term career aspirations. How do you like to be rewarded and recognized? Having those conversations up front and ahead of time before any conversation needs to happen, i.e. a feedback conversation, goes a long way to being able to adapt your leadership style in a one-on-one situation. But also, Phil, it's a miss of someone if they don't understand just how Generation Z, Generation Y, or the Millennials, or Generation X all differ. And so maybe we can get into that to talk about how to approach management in a different way.
Yeah, I would love to do that. Let me just share a story. Someone once asked me, how do I ensure that I am going to be the best possible leader? And my answer was actually very similar to what you just said. I said, well, you should meet with each individual that you lead and ask them, what would it take for me to be the best leader that you ever had? And I think initially they probably will give you a relatively generic answer because they probably don't trust you. They're probably not 100% sure you actually mean it. But if you listen to them and you decide whether it's appropriate to take their advice and you do something about it, and then you meet with them again a month later and ask the same question, and then a month later and ask the same question, over time, you will come to get a sense for what they value, and you will be able to choose whether or not their input is something that you want to adopt. And over time, if you did that with every one of your people, you would learn how best to manage at the individual level and give them what they need. Because I agree with you, Bob. It's not about this is the right way to do it. It's more about what does the person need in order to feel that they can give you their best effort, which is what they want to do. So I do agree. I think that is critical. Now, not every leader has the willingness to go do that, or sometimes the thick skin to do that. But it is a way to ensure that I am paying attention to the needs of my individual, to the individual that I'm leading.
I think that's spot on, Phil. And what I would add to that is not all managers are willing to be vulnerable enough to say that they don't have all the answers, that they don't have the magical recipe to leadership. Because if they did, they probably wouldn't be in the role they're in. They'd be on a beach somewhere because they'd have written a book and been extremely successful about it. That's why I love Brené Brown's work, particularly in her book, Dare to Lead. around just notion of being vulnerable. And I think if team members see you being vulnerable and leaning into how can I best lead you, not how I think I should lead you, because what do I know? But how can I best lead you? And then having those follow-up conversations to check in from time to time to see if everybody is still getting what they need out of that relationship. And one of the exercises that I love to do in foundational management or even leadership conversations is to have individuals think about the leader that has had the greatest impact on them in their career. And I leave it open. I say, who is that leader that's had the greatest impact on your career, and what did that person do? And so we have them spend some time individually for 5 minutes and then go into small groups and think about it, and then they report back. 90% of the time, they'll go to the positive. 10% of the time, they'll go to the negative, and the negative is actually fascinating. So, but let me come back to that. The 90% will go to the positive, and the answers would surprise many, because it's easy to work for an easy boss. And by that, I mean somebody that doesn't really hold you accountable, doesn't really check in, just leaves you alone. And that's fine in the interim, but it's easy. 90% of the people, when you go to the positive, they say the exact opposite. They say the leader that had the greatest impact in my career was that person that held me accountable, that kicked me up the you-know-what when I needed it, and gave me a hard message when I least expected it. They'll also throw in things like, they gave me a stretch assignment, they believed in me, they gave me opportunities to succeed when I didn't think I was ready. And so a lot of the themes come around feedback and professional development, which you see in the studies today about different generations. But when you go to the negative, it's almost as though that they're saying, I have been led this way. I wasn't given any feedback. I wasn't given the opportunity to grow. My boss took all the credibility and all the thanks for the role, and I didn't get any of it.
Yep.
And it's almost as though those individuals are saying, well, this is not how I want to lead. It's a fascinating exercise.
So let me share a thought with you, and then tell me what you think. If we go to the idea of understand what the folks you're leading are looking for, how they would define great leadership, we make the assumption that the leader can then provide it. So the way I think of that is I sort of have a pantry in my mind, and on the shelf of my pantry is a jar of red liquid. And when I face a situation, I go into the pantry, pull out the red jar, and deal with it. So maybe that's the ability to have a difficult conversation. If the individual needs that, I have that jar in my pantry. But if the individual needs something else, and I go into my pantry and I only have a red jar, I'm in trouble. So a great leader is filling their pantry with as many jars of different colored liquid as possible, so that when I do go to an individual and say, what is it that you think would make me provide great leadership to you? If they say, well, clear accountabilities, I can go get the yellow jar and say, okay, I know how to give you that. Or feedback that is in the moment and transparent, I get the blue jar and give them that. So I think that there's a second half to this, that being a great leader is, yes, you need to know what the individuals are looking for, but you also need to have the ability to give that to them once you know what it is. Make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And that's why management and leadership and culture building is so complex. Because if somebody says to you, I want transparent in the moment feedback, we've all taken DISC, MBTI insights, you name it, whether it's colors, shapes, animals. But what those high level assessments help you understand is that if somebody wants transparent in the moment feedback, and I've seen this where when I've asked a group that would have a driving style or a red style or just give it to me straight style and leave me alone, when I've asked them for what's your preferred style of receiving feedback, they say, well, it's a 3-part model, Bob. It's step 1, turn up. Step 2, deliver the feedback. Step 3, leave. And so that's perfect feedback and the perfect delivery for that red driving style. But when when I was facilitating that session, there was shock and horror on the other side of the room in that there was a whole other group of individuals that were saying, well, don't just leave me when you give me the feedback. I'll have lots of questions like, well, where did that come from? What was the impact? Who said that? What should I do differently? And so there's one thing to have the conversation about your preference for feedback, but it's another to go that layer down and to get a true understanding of people's preferences within a specific scenario. So we're all going to give each other feedback, whether you're a manager or a recipient of feedback, but it's important to have that conversation to the right level of depth about what does that feedback look like before you ever have to have that type of conversation.
Yeah. And I do think that that's where the training comes in, that I need to then know that I can do that. If the person's saying, I would like you to stay and give me the rationale and give me more detail and give me a chance to ask questions, you have to be able to do that effectively. You can't just say, well, wait a minute, at this point, this is when I leave, because that's not what that person is looking for. So somebody once was talking about, leadership and rocket science, and the lady said, well, I am a rocket scientist, and I'm telling you now I'm leading, and it's way more difficult than being a rocket scientist. That it is a hugely difficult job, because you're dealing with human beings and different perspectives and different viewpoints, and at any given point in time, that person that you're leading could be at a different place in their life than they were a week ago. And you have to reflect that in the way in which, if you really care about them performing at their maximum, if you simply want to treat them like a piece of machinery, well, then you don't care about any of that. And of course, the person quickly decides that that's not where they want to be. So these things that we're talking about, I think, highlight the challenge of being a great leader in today's world. Complicated, as you just said, by the fact that today's world is not homogeneous. The types of people we are leading are different backgrounds, different viewpoints. They care about the economy differently. They care about social issues differently. Very challenging days.
It's extremely challenging, and what worked 5 years ago may not work today for a host of different reasons. And every time somebody new joins the team, it's almost as though you have to start that process all over again, because when you have different ideas, different thoughts joining a team, that team chartering process, that team building process has to start all over again. And it's not a one and done either. It's management and leadership. You'll never master it. That's what makes it fascinating, and I think that's what gives me hope, is that leadership and learning and development will always be closely aligned. Businesses will always have a need for skill development, leadership development, management development. So in a certain sense, it gives us job security.
Yeah.
Well, I think, to my analogy, you need to constantly be adding to the jars in your shelves. You can't be complacent and say, I've got these things mastered and that's enough. I think you constantly have to be acquiring new skills, new abilities, so you can deal with the new challenges you face. And one of these is technology. And we'll get to that in part 2 of my talk with Bob Tweedie. We'll also discuss the importance of building trust as a leader.
It's very, very hard to build, but it's extremely easy to lose. You can lose it in one sentence. You can lose it in one email, one meeting. That trust that's been built up for weeks and months can go. And I think it comes back to that notion of orientation. Do you have your own best interests in mind, or do you have just your team?
This has been Leading What Matters Most with Phil Geldart. If you want to create a culture that drives performance and develop leaders that inspire and motivate, go to philgeldart.com. Leading What Matters Most is a production of Forbes Books.